The Trump administration is going after Raul Castro, the 94-year-old former Cuban leader. The US Justice Department has unsealed an indictment against Castro, charging him with murder and a conspiracy to kill US citizens. Now, it stems from the downing of two planes 30 years ago. The first thing that came into my mind was, why now? And is this really about justice? Or is this about regime change? Now, to help me answer those questions, I'm joined by Cecile Shea. She is a senior non-resident fellow on security and diplomacy at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And we've got a lot to talk about. But before we speak to Cecile, we need to go back in time and look at the incident which sparked this indictment. It centres on the so-called Brothers to the Rescue, which was founded by Cuban exiles. Now, the group used to fly over the Florida Straits and searching for people fleeing Cuba on makeshift rafts. Now, they also dropped leaflets over the island criticising the communist government of Fidel Castro. On February 24th, 1996, planes from Brothers to the Rescue left Miami to conduct another search, but Cuban fighter jets shot down two of the aircraft. 4 people were killed, including 3 Americans. Their bodies were never found. Now, the indictment was announced by Todd Blanche. He's the acting US Attorney General at a memorial event in Miami. So let's listen to some of what he said and then we'll continue our conversation.
Today, we are announcing an indictment charging Raul Castro and several others with conspiracy to kill US nationals. Mr. Castro and the others are charged with additional crimes as well, including destruction of aircraft and 4 individual counts of murder. President Trump is committed to restoring a very simple but important principle. If you kill Americans, we will pursue you, no matter who you are, no matter what title you hold, and in this case, no matter how much time has passed.
All right, let's speak to our guest now, Cecile Shea from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Cecile also spent over 2 decades as a US diplomat. Cecile, great to have you on DW News. Now, I posed the question just a few moments ago. Is this indictment really about justice or about regime change? What's your take?
I don't think it's about justice. There's been an indictment against 3 other, 2 individuals, one of whom is included in today's indictment, and those were the pilots who shot down the plane. The second pilot has died, and one of the generals. And those indictments were 2003, as I recall, and we've never acted on those. They've just been sitting there. The indictment that was announced today supersedes that indictment. So it seems like if we really wanted justice, we would have done something about this 23-year-old indictment that's been sitting there all this time. You know, what this is about is 2 things. First and foremost, pressuring the Cuban government, reminding them that we might have an excuse, or anyway, President Trump thinks he might have an excuse to use the U.S. military in Cuba the way that he used the U.S. military in Venezuela to kidnap leaders and move them to the U.S. for a trial. You know, the second reason might just be part of a broader campaign to remind the Cuban people that we are watching and that they should pressure their own government to take whatever action is necessary to relieve them of the current situation. And of course, Secretary of State Rubio used today to speak to the Cuban people, telling them exactly that they need to pressure their own government to step down, that it's time for a new government in Cuba.
All right, so you've mentioned a couple of key elements of this story that we're gonna come to now over the next few minutes. But Before we get to it, I do want to read the response to this indictment from the Cuban president, Miguel Díaz-Canel, on X. Now, he said, this is obviously a translation from Spanish, this is a political move without any legal basis that seeks to pad the case file that they're building to justify the senseless military aggression against Cuba. Now, the US is lying and manipulating the events around the crash of the planes from the narco-terrorist organization Brothers to the Rescue in 1996. Cecile, how precarious a situation is Díaz-Canel in now?
In terms of whether the U.S. might take military action, is that what you're asking?
Exactly, yeah.
You know, I mean, it's an excellent question. We are very overstretched in Iran right now. A lot of our special forces assets are there. I can't imagine the military would be thrilled about having to enter another engagement somewhere. I also have to say, I don't really think it's necessary. I think that there are some carrots that we could offer Cuba right now if we were really serious about wanting to move toward regime change and in the meantime, get some real positive actions from them. It's disappointing to me that the Trump administration doesn't seem to be following up on some of those openings and possibilities as robustly as it should be. I believe that the military action is occasionally necessary, but I do not believe that this is that case. We have a very good chance right now of moving forward. President Trump has a good chance of seeing some really positive changes in Cuba over the next 2 years of his presidency. And it will really be a tragedy if he lets those opportunities go and decides on violence instead.
Yeah, before we get into sort of those opportunities that you're mentioning, you know, what does all of this really mean for Raúl Castro? Like, he's 94-year-old. He's a 94-year-old man. Do you think that, you know, we could see, you mentioned earlier Venezuela with Nicolás Maduro. Do you think the US military might swoop in and take Castro, or is that something that wouldn't really happen right now?
Well, you know, I mean, it's very hard to second guess this administration sometimes, but no, I don't think it would be in any way a good thing. First of all, I'm not sure it would be moral or right, but just as importantly, it would be a disaster if he were to pass away while he was being kidnapped or while he was in US custody. Given his age and his infirmity, I don't think most judges would even allow him to take the stand. They would say he's not able to take the stand. And at any rate, it would take a year, 2 years, 3 years before the case would go to court. And, you know, will he still be alive at that point? So for very practical reasons, it would be a huge mistake to kidnap him. And it would just be wrong. I mean, it would be plain wrong. What I'm wondering about is the ages of some of the other people who are listed in that indictment. Some of them, I think, are quite elderly. 1 or 2 of them may be in his 60s. But those aren't people who are in any way in charge right now. So I don't think anything would be gained by the US military going in and trying to kidnap, you know, a retired pilot, for instance. So I hope we don't take military action against Raul Castro. I don't think it's practical. And I just think what I suspect this is just continuing pressure on the government to step down, which they do not seem in any way willing to do at this point.
Yeah, it's interesting what you're saying there about pressure. Now, I want to bring in, and you mentioned it before, Secretary of State Marco Rubio. I want to bring in his message. He is, just a bit of context for our viewers, if they're unaware, he's Cuban-American. He grew up in South Florida, which has, you know, a big Cuban-American population. And, of course, he is a fluent speaker of Spanish. And that's how he delivered his message. So let's take a listen, and then we'll come back to you, Cecile.
La razón por la que se ven obligados a sobrevivir 22 horas al día sin electricidad no se debe a un bloqueo petrolero por parte de Estados Unidos. Como ustedes saben mejor que nadie, llevan años sufriendo de apagones. La verdadera razón por la que no tienen electricidad, combustible ni alimentos es porque quienes controlan su país han saqueado miles de millones de dólares, pero nada ha sido utilizado para ayudar al pueblo.
All right, so it sounds to me, Cecile, like it's, you know, it's very clearly a direct message to Cubans in Cuba. But how is this likely to land with them?
I mean, that's a good question. I've been wondering it all day. First of all, the choice of the day that he issued that message is interesting because this is the day that Cuba remembers kicking the United States out as an occupying power, 124 years ago. So it just seems like a really strange day to now be making threats against Cuba. That's point one. Point two is, the fact is, as mismanaged as Cuba is and as problematic as its leadership is, a major reason that Cuba has had blackouts for decades, and the sole reason that it is completely out of oil right now, is because of the U.S. blockades. The U.S. blockades have prevented a lot of important machinery that Cuba needs from reaching the country. We have blocked exports from many countries over the years, but Venezuela, of course, was continuing to export oil to Cuba until the U.S. took over Venezuela. I mean, we technically haven't taken it over, but really the government is now beholden to us and has stopped shipping oil to Cuba. And that's what has led Cuba to be almost out of oil. I believe they are reserving some aside for hospitals and things like that. But for the average person, there is no oil right now. There is no electricity. And that directly is because the U.S. has stopped the export of oil from Venezuela to Cuba. Having said all those things, yes, the people of Cuba are not particularly fond of their government, but it seems like the actions of the U.S. right now are hurting those very people who we should be trying to keep on our side, meaning on the U.S. side.
Now, we actually got some voices from inside Cuba, and we're going to take a listen because it's quite interesting to hear their take.
I don't think we should hold Raul Castro responsible for something that happened 30 years ago. What if the small plane had crashed here in the city, or there had been an accident for some other reason? I don't think we should judge Castro for any of that.
You can't have someone come into your home to rule. You're the one who should be in charge of your own home, not some outsider. I think that's very wrong. And they did the right thing by shooting down those planes.
I believe it's in our best interest to build closer ties with the United States because it's a world power and controls a large portion of the international market.
Yeah, quite interesting there, the different voices, obviously, within Cuba. What's your reaction to those voices that we just heard there?
Well, I mean, you asked me earlier whether Raul Castro would ever stand trial, and I said I didn't think so. But the corollary, or in some ways the bigger question is, would he be convicted? And I think there's a good chance he would not be convicted. And I think two of the commenters just brought up some of the reasons. But really, a trial would be a trial of brothers to the rescue and how much they knew and to what degree the U.S. was warning them to stop their flights to Cuba. We know the U.S. was warning them. I was working in the State Department at the time, and I know the State Department was very concerned about what was going to happen if the flights continued. So there will be. By the way, I don't think they're a narco-terrorist organization like the president of Cuba said today, but they were warned both by Cuba and I'm pretty sure by the U.S. that they should stop these flights lest there would be some sort of mistake. That would be the best situation, or just a flat-out shoot down. And then the next question is, did Raul Castro himself authorize shooting down of these planes? And did the pilots know that the planes were in international airspace? The planes were on their way to Cuban airspace, but they were still in international airspace. So, yeah, it was clearly a violation of international law at that point to shoot them down. But I think that the outcome of a trial in the U.S., as unlikely as that trial would be, I think that, there's a significant chance that Castro would be found not guilty.
Yeah, it's interesting. And just sticking as well with Marco Rubio as well, what is the plan for Cuba? I mean, he's the Secretary of State. It's obviously a very personal issue for him as a Cuban American and for his own personal, I suppose, history as well. But is there sort of a plan that, or could you give us a bit of background on what he's sort of said about Cuba and what he would like to see happen? Is there any kind of indication of what direction the U.S. may take?
Well, so this is where I think we're really missing an opportunity. What we should be doing is taking what for wins, the things that Cuba has offered. And again, we don't know officially that Cuba has accepted or offered to do certain things, but there's been a lot of press of it saying, for instance, that they have agreed to let out their political prisoners. Well, that would mean there would be a political opposition in the country. They have agreed to open up their economy. They have agreed to let money from Cuban exiles be invested in the country. These are huge things that we have wanted for many years. And if those things happen, we would say, okay, do all those things and then spend the next 2 years preparing for an election. We want to see an orderly development of a democratic process in Cuba. Let's see an election. You can run in the election. This will give them a chance to save face. But we want to see a transition to democracy. I think we might have a lot of success with that approach. Instead of just constant threats, let's take the things that Cuba is offering and then work with them to move toward an orderly transition that would allow the leaders at the top to save some amount of face. That would be the best scenario. But to answer your question, my fear is, especially after seeing how we misjudged the situation in Iran, my fear is that they don't have a day after plan. They don't have a who would step into the breach instead. We've seems like we've gotten lucky in Venezuela that some of the deputies there have turned out to be pretty good and willing to work with the United States. But you bring up an important question. It's not enough to ask for regime change if you don't know what the next regime is going to be. And it could turn out to be a more anti-American regime than the one that we have now. And that would really be bad for the United States and for the Cuban people.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, interesting as well point that you were making earlier as well, which was, of course, you were talking there about sort of the political aspect there. But of course, there's this economic aspect which also plays into politics as well, which is, of course, the embargo, this 60-year-old embargo. And earlier, Donald Trump said that an announcement would be made, to quote him, pretty soon. Do you expect any change there? I mean, I know this is, you said it as well earlier, that it's very difficult to kind of gauge this administration. But is this sort of another key part of this transition that you were mentioning there?
Yeah, I mean, lowering the embargo probably in a step-by-step way, but, certainly making it easier for Americans to travel to Cuba with the goal of completely ending all restrictions on American travel to Cuba in the near future. That would be something very important to the Cuban economy. Allowing more oil into the country with the goal being completely ending the embargo against oil, allowing spare parts into the country, allowing cars into I mean, we could do a great deal and have them, agree to accept American cars at zero tariff. And that would be good for the American auto industry as well as good for the Cuban people. So there are a lot of things that it seems like the Cuban leadership is willing to do right now, particularly if it will prevent military action against their country. And these would be wins for Cuba. These would be wins for the U.S. And I think ultimately they would be wins for the global economy.
What about Cuban American voters in the U.S.? Now, presumably they're going to support a lot of what we've been discussing here of any sort of change within Cuba itself. Tell us how important they are to Trump and his administration.
So there's really two groups of Cuban voters. And a lot of us still think about the older guard, who literally are older now. These are people who either came over during the revolution in the late 50s, early 60s, or whose parents came over, some of whom were extremely wealthy and powerful in Cuba. I think the most famous of those in the United States and perhaps in Europe too is Desi Arnaz. His family was very powerful and wealthy in Cuba, and then they came to the U.S. and had to start with less than nothing, basically. And those people have a great deal of anger over what happened to them and a great desire to get some of their money and their prestige back. However, the younger generations, particularly those who have come to the U.S. in the last 20 years, and there has been quite a bit of immigration from Cuba to the U.S., they don't have the same strong feelings. They obviously weren't alive during the revolution. They have a much more nuanced view of the government. The government may have done some good things, it's done some bad things, and they are much more forward-looking. And they tend to be not politically involved at the intense level that the older generation was, and to a certain degree still is. Now, that older generation are Donald Trump's friends, right? They are the people that he socializes with in Florida. And they still have a lot of political influence, and they still make a lot of big political donations. But if the community at the whole has changed, and so there's probably room now for a new generation of politicians in the U.S. to walk a finer line and be willing to open up more conversation with Cuba in the same way that the Obama administration did. For 8 years, the Obama administration really was moving toward a more normal relationship with Cuba. And then President Biden kind of went back the other direction and was closer to the Trump model, although not condoning violence or threatening violence or anything like that.
So essentially, from what you're saying, I mean, Cuban Americans would be very much against, say, any type of intervention from Donald Trump.
Well, I think that some of the older, I can't speak for the entire Cuban American population or even some of them. What the polling shows that there is a generational difference, and indeed, a lot of the, I think I've read it's over 1.5 million now immigrants who have come in the last 20 or 30 years. They still have family in Cuba, so they really would have very mixed feelings about any kind of military operation at this point. I think Cuban Americans want to see a transition. They certainly want to be able to travel to Cuba. They would like to be able to invest in Cuba, but that's different than wanting to see Cuba invaded. And as I said earlier, this is the day that Cubans celebrate pushing the Americans out in 1902, I think it was. So I think we need to be careful about bringing up those kinds of memories.
Cecile, really fascinating speaking to you and getting that analysis on Cuba. I find it personally a really fascinating country, and it's great to get these developments that we're seeing broken down. Cecile Shea from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure to be here today.
What do you think? Is this about justice or regime change? Should Raul Castro be looking out of his window for a US chopper? Let us know in the comments. If you like this video, please hit that like button. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe. I'm Pablo Foley-Diaz. Thanks for watching. See you again.